Hello. If you are here right now, then you are present at the beginning of the live stream. I want to take just a few seconds to give other folks the chance to trickle in. But yeah, I have had a hard time, as many people have over the past months, and writing has been hard, and kind of keeping life together has been hard, but I'm feeling a bit more like, instead of being up to about here, like where I was like, get a breath and then have to deal with stuff. I feel a little bit more like I'm kind of, chest deep wading water. And it's easier to kind of react to prompts and talk about stuff than it is to come up with an essay topic on my own, especially because I don't know necessarily what people are as interested in or weren't wondering about, because like the pandemic has changed a bunch of stuff about how publishing works. And like I did a lot of stuff talking about conventions, and in-person conventions are largely not happening, and some of them are going to start coming back. But a lot of things are going to be different than they were pre-pandemic just because of how stuff is rearranged. But I love doing live stuff. I love broadcasting games live. I love, chatting with people. There's an energy to the back and forth here that is really different than just sitting and writing an essay, because that is more like sitting and writing fiction, even though there's definitely some big differences between them. So we have a couple of questions already. If you are watching live, you are welcome to add questions in the chat. I am monitoring that. And then I've got a couple of questions that came in ahead of time that I will get through, and we'll go for a while. I'm guessing somewhere between a half an hour and an hour. If there's a lot of questions, if things are really chugging along, then I may go a little bit longer, because then that's probably going to be energizing for me, and that'll be really cool. So I'm going to start with a question from Patreon, and this reads, what should gamers who haven't, even through the pandemic, tried a streaming RPG game know for both players and GMs alike? So I had done a fair bit of tabletop gaming online before the pandemic. I have some friends in the Midwest who I knew when I lived in Indiana who were doing online gaming and invited me to join them, and I've been playing with them for 5 years now across a half dozen different campaigns. And we've used a couple of different platforms. So I'll talk about platforms and then like kind of how to have a better game experience based on my experiences there. I think we've used Google Meetings or Google Hangouts for a while before it turned into like Google Meet or whatever. I haven't really used this newest version of the Google Meeting thing, because it was Hangouts, and then there was, I think, maybe something even before it. With those tools, the best one is the one that's easiest for everybody involved. I think that there are some that are going to be easier for other stuff. Like Discord is cool because you can get dice rolling bots in Discord. But maybe Google Meet is easier because then not everybody in your group has to create yet another account on yet another website. I know there's a lot of people, myself included, who are not getting onto new platforms as much because we already have to check how many different things. So like I could get an email, I could get a Facebook message, I could get a Twitter DM, I could get a text, I could get a Slack DM, I could get a Discord DM, and that's just too many things for a lot of people. So one barrier that you may have is getting someone to adopt yet another system. Maybe everybody is gotten used to Zoom, and somebody has an account or can set up an account where you can use Zoom. I know that there's one level of Zoom where your meeting tops up, it like can't go longer than an hour, and that may be hard for gaming unless you just like take a break every hour and restart. Maybe that will work just fine for you. The trick there is that Zoom does not record your chat automatically. So if you want to keep track of your chat, that system may not work as well for you. So I've used Google Hangouts. I've used Discord, has worked pretty well. That is what my like Midwest gaming group uses basically all the time at this point. And that's nice because we have a server where we have the chat for the different games that we play together, and then we have the live channel. Discord's really nice because you can have that up and move between them pretty easily. And as I said, you can get dice rolling bots for Discord. I don't use them so much for those games, but I've played in other stuff where having the Discord bot can be pretty handy. Other places, like if you are looking for a game, Roll20 hosts a lot of discussion, like looking for group kinds of things. If you're looking to play D&D 5e, you'll have the easiest time compared to anything else, just because it's such a big part of the market. I think there's also a lot of Pathfinder games there. But if you're willing to GM, you may have an easier time finding something. Check to see if there is a Discord community for the games that you like. Like, oh, I really like Blades in the Dark. There's a Blades in the Dark Discord. I like Friends of the Table, the podcast, and I'm interested in people playing games with people who have like that same podcast. And maybe there's going to be more aesthetic overlap there. There's a Friends of the Table Discord that you can get access to, or find people that way. Magpie Games does paid DM games where you can pay for a one shot, a two shot, or like a short campaign. And then they have DMs and GMs that they've vetted. And that's mostly to run games published by Magpie. So that's kind of, it's like content marketing, but also it's a way to play. So during the pandemic, I have gotten to do some other one shots with all of these different platforms. And there's some like online conventions that will sometimes like host games that you can play in. Gauntlet Con does that, and you could join the Gauntlet, which is an online games community, and they're constantly setting up and running games. So that's like some tech stuff and some logistics, like where to find a game. In terms of how to have a good time playing that game, I think what I found is having the like everybody settling in and like getting snacks and catching up. Plan that as part of your game time. Like in an in-person game, it'd be like, okay, everybody show up at 1 and we're going to try to get started playing, like getting into scene at 1:30. Having that like settling in time lets you like maintain relationships with these other people as people, especially if they're friends who you are already friends with and you want to game with. Gaming is a fun social thing, but it can be nice, I've found, to have that settling in time. It also I found that like, okay, cool. At 7 p.m. we're going to start playing, and we try to start playing right away. Sometimes that can be hard for somebody to like key shift that quickly, especially if you're like jumping really into an intense scene or a fight or something. So having a little bit of that warm up time in the same way that I traditionally have experienced having that when you play in person. I think figuring out what your game's policy is on like getting up and like going to get water, or going to the bathroom or something, deciding, okay, here are when we're going to specifically take breaks. And if you can, try not to step away from the table unless there's those breaks. Or maybe you say, step away from the table whenever you want, no worries, we'll adjust as needed. Or maybe you say, please type in chat if you need to step away, just so we know what's up. Because sometimes when you have to step away, it's like, oh, my dog is in trouble. I need to go take care of my dog or my baby, or I have to help bring the groceries in. And if you can give some information, that may make it easier for the rest of your group to adjust, like to know, oh, do we need to like take a break here? Or can we just like shift to a different part of a different scene or a different part of how we're playing, so that there's not so much of an interruption based on you needing to do things with your own life. Like I can have a hard time staying seated and dialed in for like 4 hours in a row. I really like having a break in there. When I run games, I try to have a break, and that's as much for me as for anybody else. And when I'm being good, I minimize the amount of other other things that I have. Like, I don't want to be checking my phone or like tabbing around other bits of the internet, but sometimes I do because my attention wanes and like I need more inputs or something. Like I put like a little tactile sticker thing on my desk to have like a different way of kind of just giving myself some stimulus or input. Just because when I'm here at this desk, it's usually for one of a few things. It's writing, and I have to go to extra work to like dial myself in to focus on writing, or I'm like playing a video game, or I'm just like doing general internet stuff. And in that mode, I tend to be like a very multi-tab kind of browser grazer type of person. And that behavior can bleed into game because I'm physically in the same space and I'm still probably using internet windows. Like for a Star Wars game I'm in, I have PDFs open, I have a dice roller app open on a website, I have the Discord going, and maybe I have some other PDFs for reference because we're playing the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game that like just has a bunch of different things to keep track of, and I'm not as familiar with that game. So I already have this multi-tab system going on, and that can be harder. All of this is good to talk over with your fellow players before you start. Be like, hey, I know we haven't streamed online before, so it's probably useful to talk about like, how do we want this to look? Do we want playing online to be basically the same as when we played in person, except we're using cameras? And what does that mean? And just making sure that there aren't like hurt feelings or misaligned expectations before you start playing. Something else that can be handy with online tools is figuring out, is there a way to have your safety tools as readily accessible when you're playing online as you would in person? If you're playing around a table and there's literally an X card, like a Post-it note with an X written on it, so that someone can just reach out and touch when they need to use the X card to like pause the play. You can get an X card that integrates into Roll20, or you figure out what other tools or methods we're going to use to make sure that people have that available to them. You may also change like how long or how frequently you're playing. You decide, do we want to use Roll20? Do we want to use D&D Beyond? What tools can we access that will make playing online as fun and as easy as possible? I've found that the energy, and this gets a little woo-woo, but hopefully not in a way that's hard to understand. And anybody who's been through the pandemic probably is likely to feel this way. It's different to be around a table with 5 people than it is to look on a Zoom page at 4 other people. And like, it can be weird and anxiety making to like have a little video picture-in-picture of yourself as you're like constantly like experiencing yourself talking in a mirror, like, I use my hands too much, or blah, with something with my hair, and like you could be self-conscious about it. And it's just different to have the different windows open. And maybe not everybody wants to use video for whatever reason. And then you're just playing off of audio. And I found that that's pretty hard for me. One, because I like using body language when I'm role playing. I think that probably comes from LARPing a lot that I did in college. And it's just a way that I experience in like playing RPGs. But if everybody's just doing audio, maybe you can do that for yourself because it's like a performance aid, but that's not then going to get conveyed to the other people. So being on the same page about, do we want to use video? Do we want to just do audio? Do you want to have this open door policy about coming and going as you need? Like, does everybody have the tech that they need? Like in the pandemic, I spent some money to get this really fancy microphone. I bought a ring light because I'm very, very pale, like northern and Western European mutt, and I like not looking as much of like a ghost as I would otherwise. But that's all extra bits of money. People may not have the money to go and get a nice mic. Maybe they can only maybe they're just using their laptop's webcam, and so they're not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to stream 1080p. Maybe they don't have the internet to stream 1080p. So you're going to have to discuss some different topics than you would playing in person. But there are things you have to talk about in person that are different. Like, is somebody going to bring snacks? Are we going to order food? Are we going to take a dinner break? Or are we going to eat while we're playing? Like, does somebody need to bring their own chair because the chairs at the person's house who's hosting like aren't really accessible to one of the players for whatever reason? Like, I need more back support, or I need to be able to put my feet up, otherwise I get too fidgety. Like, in your own space, you can control some of that in a way that's different. But it's also important to like communicate whatever your needs are. And you may find that your needs, that you realize more needs once you start playing. And then that's going to be another time to check in and communicate with your fellow players. And there may be people who just don't want to play online, or who want to play different games online. And it's going to be like, It's going to take some extra logistics, and a lot of people are already pretty strained because of not having access to things, or job stuff or whatever being different. I've been really lucky to be able to keep playing with the friends who I've been playing with, so I got to maintain that. And during the pandemic, like right at the start of the pandemic or just before, I started playing in the Speculate game, Case of the Cindered Seal, that Brandon GMs for Speculate, and then Brandon came on as a co-host. And now I'm GMing the Rebel Crown game, Splendor and Shadow, for Brandon and Greg, and then for the rest of our players. And that's been a great way for me to be able to connect. And I was already used to streaming and playing online, so it was an easier transition for me, which I was really grateful for. So I hope that is a good kind of baseline set of things to cover. Paul, if you're here and you have any follow-ups, please go ahead and throw them in the chat. And then anybody else, if you have questions inspired by this or other topics, I'd like to stay mostly focused on gaming, business of publishing, and like craft of writing. But if you have like questions about like, tell me about your experience in the essay, like I can probably talk about that a bit. Another question that I got is asking about the basics of the business and publishing end of tabletop role-playing games. So like even just like an ABCs level thing. So I am not super experienced in this part, but I know people who are, and I have learned some of what I take to be the very basics of this. So for anybody who's watching, if you've heard this type of basics from somebody else who is an active professional in that field, there's a good chance you should listen to them instead of me here. But I'm happy to share the little bit of information that I have based on the stuff that I've done and the people who I know who are working in that space. The tabletop writing space is overwhelmingly dominated by D&D. It's 80-something+% of the market in terms of dollars, like dollars generated in the gaming sphere. Around 80 or more than 80% are D&D. The next biggest is Pathfinder, and then it kind of goes down from there. Like Call of Cthulhu is a big one. So if you're trying to get into TTRPGs as a way of making money as a writer, you're probably going to be well served to work in that D&D space and the 5e kind of SRD space around it, because there's writing for D&D, the company, not too many people get to do. They have been expanding who they call on and who they tap to write and contribute, and specifically reaching out to marginalized voices and marginalized writers, which is really good. But WotC is also like a very big company, part of Hasbro, and they've done some shit on which maybe you don't want to work with them directly. But there are a lot of people who are making either D&D content through the DMs Guild, which is basically as long as you fit like specific legal guidelines about what you can and can't use and from D&D official material, you can publish on the DMs Guild and charge for it like it's KDP. On like the fiction and nonfiction space, you get most of the money. D&D gets some of the money, and you put together your own cover, you do your own formatting and things like that. You have to do that stuff, but that's if you're publishing content of your own. If I wanted to create a character class that was, a new character class for D&D, I could do that, commission art, do my own layout, or pay for somebody to do layout, create that file, and upload it to DMs Guild. I could also try to get work writing, 1,000 to 10,000 word chunks, probably closer to 1,000 word chunks to begin with on somebody else's project. That could be, hey, I'm doing a DMs Guild project and I'm looking for people to help me fill out this book. And for that, the place that I know to look for that is basically Twitter. And that involves following people who are actively publishing in that space, and especially people who spread kind of news of calls for production. So that might mean following some publishers that are working that space. Maybe it's you follow MCDM because that company has been bringing on writers to kind of fill out the books that they've been working on, and they pay pretty well. It might mean like going to the DMs Guild, finding a couple of companies who create things that you think are pretty good, and maybe try to reach out to those writers and say, hey, I really liked, this thing from your section in this book. If you know who wrote what section, that's the thing that's tricky. In an anthology, if I have a story on page 36, it says, name of story by Michael R. Underwood, page 36. A lot of the work for hire in tabletop is more piecemeal than that. And so the book itself may not say, oh yeah, Dan Lehman Kennedy is a friend of mine who works in this space, and he's done some work for hire for people. The book, the copyright page might not say this section by Dan Lehman Kennedy. It might say additional material by Dan. So that makes it a little bit more opaque. So reaching out to people and asking if they're okay to share a little bit of their time and their experience, send them money on Ko-fi or something, or buy them a food, some food, because they're doing labor to tell you about working in that space. And maybe something that people can share is where they look and listen to how to get work in the tabletop space. There are other companies either in the 5e space or elsewhere in publishing who are also bring on writers. And if you have a track record in another form of writing, you may have an easier time getting work writing for TTRPG, because your resume may not have a lot of game material on it, but you can say, well, I've published, this many short stories. So somebody who you are potentially working for could know, okay, they have some skill in some type of writing. But like a lot of things, the best way to get work in a space is to do work in that space. Write your own adventure, put it on your website, put it on your Patreon, put together a really basic thing to go on DM's Guild, publish games on itch.io. There is a huge indie scene that is largely on the marketplace platform, itch.io. Itch kind of came into popularity through indie video games, but there's also a lot of indie tabletop there, especially in the Power by the Apocalypse, Forged in the Dark, and Belonging Outside Belonging ecosystems, where there's one game with each of those, and then there's a way that you can write games using those mechanics but publish them on your own. For each of them, check out what you're required to do to not be a jerk and use things that you're not supposed to be allowed to use. So I've been interested in getting into the tabletop space. I have not, and I've done a little bit of stuff. I made a small contribution to my friend Greg's Forbidden Library. So I was a stretch goal writer. And so I wrote basically a magic item book that is less magic and more this is a sword manual in the style of the Western European masters in the late medieval and Renaissance period. And so there was some flavor and there was some mechanics, and it's a short little entries. But I have now written in the tabletop space. It's a small individual credit. I've done work for hire prose for a different project as part of a Kickstarter for my friend Jack Norris for his game Tian Sha, and that was 6 or so years ago. So I've written a little bit of fiction for the tabletop space, and I've written a little bit of game writing for that space. If I wanted to find more, I would reach out to friends who I have who work in that space. I have seen some calls for writing that I've decided to pass on because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty taxed. I'm having a hard time getting through revisions on this project that I'm still excited about, and one that I think once it's to the point where it can go out and sell and my agent can take it out, I'm really excited to see what happens. But it's been a slog. And I have been working on the Genrenauts tabletop role-playing game, but that's still at early stages. And because I own the IP it's based off of, I'm more likely to want to publish it myself or to reach out to a publisher and sell it that way versus focusing on writing in other people's IP. I think writing in other people's IP is probably the way to get into and get more games writing work faster. But my objective is not, okay, I want to get to the point where I make $5,000 this year on tabletop games writing. If that was my goal, I would be doing things different. I would be looking for opportunities to contribute to DM's Guild projects, and I would be putting out small projects of my own to try to get my name out there. Something else you can do that may connect to the publishing end of TTRPGs is being active as an audience member and in promoting actual play. because there's a lot of actual play that is tied directly to the publication of the books that they're playing. Like, oh, okay, Into the Motherlands is like the official stream of the game Into the Motherlands. Or there might be a game that's like coming to Kickstarter and they are doing some actual play, and you watch that and go, actually, this seems like it's really up my vibe, like it's really up my alley. And then maybe they're going to call for contributors either as stretch goals or like, oh, we're going to expand the material that we're producing and we're going to call for new writers. And that's one way you can look. Or it's just a way of getting to know the people who are in the actual play space, and the actual play space and the like publishing end of TTRPG overlaps a lot. It's not one-to-one, but there is a lot of overlap. People who are designers are also players. GMs are also designers, or people work at companies and then they do actual play for fun because they got into TTRPGs because it was something that they really loved. I believe that Pathfinder has some ways of like trying to get on their radar as well. There is a how to write for Pathfinder video that you can find on YouTube, but it's a few years old. I don't know whether it's current. So I'm going to gesture toward that as an option to investigate, but I have not watched that whole video. I saw it when I was doing a little bit of research before this stream, so I can't vouch for it. And I know it's a little old, but it's maybe a place to start. I think Paizo has forums. And that's probably another place to go and look, because maybe people are soliciting writers there, or you'll get a sense of what's going on in terms of like how people can write for Paizo to do stuff for Pathfinder, which is more different than D&D 5e than original Pathfinder was from D&D 3, but still shares a lot of material. And genre-wise, D&D as a genre overlaps with what Pathfinder does in a not tiny way, in my experience. So we have another question from Paul in the chat. Hi, Paul. If you're still here, thanks so much for tuning in live. For an extensive world like the Genrenauts, what tools do you personally use to keep universe or universes details straight and consistent through the works? Because I haven't gone back to the same world again and again, like there haven't been 3 novellas in the space opera world, I have not had to do a whole lot of wiki making. But I think if I were actively publishing Genrenauts novellas and stories like every year or like a few times every year, I would do myself the favor of having like a canonical Scrivener file. I like writing in Scrivener. I do most of my first drafting and early revision in Scrivener because I can move chapters around and I can have all the supplemental material. The core of Genrenauts is still the main team. You know, Leah, King, Shirin, Roman, so on and so forth. And I have a really strong handle on those people as characters. But when I go to do new Genrenaut stuff, I tend to at least skim what I already have. There's a point at which that will become way more onerous, because at the moment it's skim the whole Genrenauts collection that you can see right there, and then think about whether I need to go back over and reread the short stories that are not in that collection, and to do so. For working on the Genrenauts RPG, that has made me kind of mentally go back through things, and I've also had to clarify and think about some of like the behind the scenes cosmology of Genrenauts, because I'm then trying to express it in for the RPG in a way that is intelligible, especially to people who have not already read the stories. Because maybe if the RPG, if I publish it, self-publish it, or get a publisher and it takes off, there will absolutely be people who play that game and have never read Genrenauts, that where Genrenauts is a role-playing game to them, and then they will discover that it's based on some fiction, and maybe they will or won't read that. And to communicate how Genrenauts works to them, I'm going to have to be explicit about things that I had been implicit or had not mentioned specifically in the fiction, because the fiction is presented through the perspective of the characters who are on these different missions. And so I wouldn't necessarily explain like, this is the rate at which Ripple exacerbates and, the timing in which you would have to do something to avoid dimensional disaster. Like I'll be more specific about that in the game book. For other projects, like for the novel that's been really tough, I have tried to have a lot more written down in Scrivener. So for that, I have my working revision document where I have the things I want to revise, and then I just use strike through when they're done. So I can remember what I have done, and I tend to sort that by character or by subtopic. Like, okay, there's an alien invasion in the backstory. So anything that's about revising what happened there or flashbacks to that invasion is its own section. Then I have old documents that are like previous revisions, versions of what that novel was going to be that I'm not using, and those are locked away in folders that are minimized. And so I just don't go into those folders because I'm not actively working on that type of material. So I have my revision notes, I have my working outline that I kind of made for myself before I started writing, and I've gone back and kind of redone that a couple of times. And sometimes I will post that into sections as I'm doing revision. And then I have individual separate documents for this main character and her cast, this other main character and her cast, these secondary characters, other cast members. And then sometimes I will develop new bits to add in as their own separate document outside of the folder structure of the manuscript itself. So like, here's the project level, and then there's the manuscript level. And sometimes I'll have manuscript here, but then I'll have new documents that are on the project level, but not in the manuscript, because I look at the manuscript to see what like my word count is, and to look at like the balance of POV characters and things like that. So using Scrivener as, it's not a wiki, but it is like a project management program in a certain way, not in like a big business like project management program with like fancy like CMS kinds of things. That's not that. Because I am in between pure plotter and pure pantser, a lot of times I just kind of adjust process as I need it. And then if I realize that I've kind of, that I was like, oh, I really should have X, then I tend to go back and try to build myself as much scaffolding as I need to be able to move forward. But I have not been the person who creates a whole wiki for a project before I start writing. There may be projects where that's going to be more useful. It would have been great if I had just gone ahead and made a wiki for Born to the Blade, because collaboration makes this sometimes trickier, because I can't just decide to do something in the moment, because other people are also using that material. So if I decided something in the moment that adds to the world building, I need to check in with people. And having a wiki, especially that all the contributors could have accessed, would have been handy there. And if I were to get to do more with Born to the Blade, or to do another collaborative project like that, I might try to, if not make a wiki, maybe I would make a Discord, and there would be like world building channel, characters channel, and things like that to keep stuff more organized. I've also used a fair bit of Google Docs, where I have like, here's a folder, and I'll just like put PDFs for a game that I'm playing with people, or like I'll put my game prep and then the public document, like using Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Drive, and putting those all in a place to keep my thoughts and the resources that I need organized. And that's been pretty handy. That's also good because I can work on it on my laptop or on the computer I'm on now, which is like my streaming system, because it has better processing and things, and it can it works with the mic. It's what the mic is hooked up to and all that kind of stuff. But if everything's in Google Docs, I can access it from either, and it will just save instead of having to like put stuff into Dropbox. It's pretty easy. I'm sure there are other programs that do that. Google is not the be all end all, but it's handy, and that's what I've been using. So we're a little bit past a half an hour. I have one other topic that I was interested in talking about because like I just did it. So I think I'll go on that for a bit. And if other folks who are watching have any other questions that you want to try to get in, please go ahead and put those into chat now. Otherwise, I'll probably wrap after talking about Powered by the Apocalypse. So yesterday I ran a one-shot of Monster of the Week by Michael Sands, published by Evil Hat, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse urban fantasy role-playing game. So if you're not familiar with the term, Powered by the Apocalypse is a term for role-playing games that use the core framework of a game called Apocalypse World. Apocalypse World is a game by Vincent and Mackay Baker. Their first version of Apocalypse World, I think, came out in about 2010 and has made a big impact on a part of the independent tabletop role-playing games space. Monster of the Week is one of the more popular Powered by the Apocalypse games. So it's the major touchstones that I use when I play it are Buffy and Angel, the TV shows, as well as Supernatural, the 16 season long show. I only watched the first 5 seasons, so I don't refer to the other stuff later on. But at its core, it is a procedural urban fantasy like mystery action show. It's not like a cop show in the version of cop shows that are like more focused on the mystery and the detective work. It's more like go to a place, try to figure out what's going on, realize there's a monster there, try to figure out what the monster's weaknesses are, maybe fight the monster and have to run away because you don't know the weaknesses, and then you do some more research, and then now that you figured out what the monster's researches are, you go and try to hunt it down to either reason with it or kill it or drive it off or rescue the people who are in danger. And it's kind of got like a pulp vibe to it. And in the game that I ran yesterday, I had not run Monster of the Week before. I've run Apocalypse World, specifically the Burning Over. There's a version that's a modification of the second edition, and I've run that, which has some good extra tools. But I had not run Monster of the Week, and I've not played nearly as much Powered by the Apocalypse as I have now played Forged in the Dark. So games that build on the framework of Blades in the Dark. So between Case of the Cindered Seal and other things that I've done, like games that I've played with the kind of Midwest home group, I've played on a ton more Forged in the Dark. Forged in the Dark builds on Powered by the Apocalypse, but also goes away in some different things. A thing that I really like in Powered by the Apocalypse that I got to use a fair bit yesterday, and this is not unique to these games, but I really came to understand and make use of this tool through reading and seeing people play Powered by the Apocalypse games. And that's the idea of just straight up asking questions of the characters and sometimes asking questions of the players. So that might look like asking the character who plays the monstrous playbook, like, oh, you're a half vampire. Like, oh, like what is it like when you like take the life essence from people? Are you like drinking their blood, more traditional vampire style? What's that like? Tell me a little bit about how that works. I'm the GM. I could tell them this is how it works. But oftentimes I'm more interested in sharing some narrative authority with the other players because I like this shared storytelling bit. I had such a great time doing Born of the Blade, and I really like playing tabletop games that I've tried to move in that direction of a slightly flatter hierarchy of storytelling power. So I ask, like, what's interesting for you? Like, what version of being a vampire is interesting to you? Or do you want to like be an energy vampire and like kind of just suck some life force off of someone and, just take little sips or something? Letting people describe things in their own words can be really fun because it makes space for people to showcase their own creativity, and it gives us the opportunity to talk through things live. Because I might ask a question and maybe somebody doesn't have a fully formed thought, but they say like, well, I kind of don't want to just like suck blood, but I don't really know something else. And then I might say, oh, okay, like I'm interested in pinning that down now because I think it's going to be relevant. Is it something like X or Y? And maybe I give 2 or 3 options, but also make sure to leave space for someone to go, oh, okay, well, no, it's not any of those. Now I know what it is. And have that kind of conversation to fill out world details and to leave open spaces for people to make the world their own in some ways. I found that at the start of a game, asking questions can be really helpful for players to kind of get a firmer handle on the characters, but also for us to figure out some of how the characters are connected to each other. So Monster of the Week has a history framework, which is kind of builds on a framework from Apocalypse World. So the monstrous character might say, you almost killed this person, but didn't. Why? And how do you, what's your relationship now? And so at the start of a campaign, whoever's playing the monstrous would say, hey, I'm interested in having somebody, like having almost killed somebody, but then I didn't, maybe you talked me down or something. And that, because that creates a really intense relationship with someone. Like, wow, you, like, this person almost killed you, but we need to figure out a way that that is interesting for moving forward and playing, and not something that would like tear the group apart, because maybe this person like absolutely would not want to work with you. So we have to figure out a way for it to be interesting and dramatic, but not to kind of ground um, like punch a hole in the hold of the game. If the boat were a game, like, oh, you don't want to sink the game before it starts. You want to figure out how to make it additive and generative. Um, and so again, that's going to be a conversation. It's going to be a bit of negotiation, and it's kind of, it's like playing an improv game. Is I ask a question and try to have it there be a little bit of a prompt to it, for then someone to go, oh yeah, I've got an idea. I want to do X and Y and Z, and then maybe we do a little bit of back and forth, or maybe I try to pull in another player. Um, and then in play, I will also sometimes ask questions of a player. You know, and this is all as encouraged by these books. Is this the first time that you've X'd? How do how is your character feeling right now? Or asking the character like directly, like, Suzette, how are you feeling right now? Or how does Suzette feel about this thing that just happened? And giving people the chance to really like put their character's emotions on display, or to be really explicit, or to say, oh, well, you would know, these three people would know that when Suzette does X, it means that she's feeling like this. And maybe you haven't displayed that before, but you're giving some backfill. A lot of these tools are so that you can tell a story that isn't, these four characters are meeting today, and then they're going to do a thing. You can establish that these characters have some of a relationship, some of a backstory, and you fill it in as you need to. And that conversation, that tool is so fun for me, because I often use those conversations to feed into what I was going to do with the game, or to just like completely turn things. And Power of Apocalypse gives that really cool set of tools, but it also is a loose enough game for me as I see it, that in the game that I played yesterday, I completely turned directions a few times during the game. I had prep, like, here are some characters, here's the kind of timeline if the characters don't intervene, but I added a whole specific element of like the climactic scene based on some of how the characters behaved and how they approached it. So like, oh, actually, I want to add an element here to create some challenges, and then they were reacting to that, and then I moved some of what I was going to try to do, what I was going to do with the monster, and added some elements and changed how things were applied just on the fly. And that's easier to do for me in a one shot than in a campaign, because in a campaign I have a little bit more long-term thinking about where we're going to go. But I've still adjusted in this big way. Anyone who's watched the Rebel Crown series that I'm GMing for Speculate, in the, not the most recent episode, but the one before that, the characters latched onto a detail that I introduced about some NPCs and said, hey, Mike, could we, is there an X? And I had not planned for there to be an X, but that would be really cool. And it would let me do a lot of what I wanted to do, or what I was excited to enable for the characters to do. And so we just leaned all the way into it. And I completely changed what I was expecting that to be like. And I think that is an important, it's important to be comfortable doing that in some ways in games like Power by the Apocalypse or Forged in the Dark, especially in Forged in the Dark games where the group or the team or the gang decides how they want to address challenges, or decides what missions they want to go on. And Rebel Crown is that kind of game where it is really player driven, because the player group are trying to achieve a big change to the status quo, and it's up to them to determine how they're going to do it. And again, that's another way of sharing power and sharing narrative authority, because I show up to the game, I'm like, okay, cool. How are you going to change the world? What do you want to do? And how are you going to do it? And then I try to react honestly with the world and create the framework so that they have something to bounce off of, and so they can pursue their agendas and their interests in what they want to like do and kind of cool stuff that they want to try to achieve. So I am going to double check real quick to see if there are any other questions that have shown up on the Patreon posts. And if not, I think I am about ready to wrap. So this format's really fun for me because it's got the energy of a live thing, and I can still react to people. It could become a little bit of a conversation of its own. I can say I'm going to do a thing, tell patrons that I'm going to do a thing, and then I have to stick to that, which is easier for me than putting something on my calendar for Thursday, write essay. And sometimes I can do that, and sometimes it's really hard to get that energy together. So for everybody who is watching this after the stream and who are patrons, I would really love to hear from you on the Patreon posts, whether this format is useful for you, if it's interesting. I'll look at the views to see how many people are going and watching. I want this to be useful for you. It's interesting and fun and fulfilling for me, but because you all have been great supporters, especially through the pandemic, as I've not been able to do as much, if you're really hoping to see more essays or you're interested in covering material through that format instead, please just let me know, and I will try to do that as much as I can. If you are watching this just on YouTube and you're not a patron, you could have watched this several weeks earlier at the minimum by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Michael R. Underwood. If you found this somehow randomly and you've never heard of me before, you can find me on Twitter at Mike R. Underwood or my website at michaelrunderwood.com. I think in the future, I will try to do a little bit of more of a good introduction of myself at the beginning of the stream, knowing that these I'm probably going to set to go public later on, because since I have not been as active on Twitter and I have not been able to go to conventions, I don't have as many ways of reaching people who I don't already know. And this is a way that I can try to do that, because maybe you're a patron and you liked what I had to say and you share that with other people. Or maybe you've found this 3 years down the road because the internet, like time is long or whatever. So whenever you're watching this, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.